Trump stood on the tarmac at Dover Air Force Base and saluted 6 flag-draped transfer cases. For a few minutes, the noise of war gave way to the oldest ritual a military power has, bringing its dead home. No slogan can soften that scene. No speech can outrun it. 6 American service members killed in Kuwait were returned to U.S. Soil and the president, the first lady, the vice president, the defense secretary, and grieving families were there to receive them. This was not a campaign rally moment. It was not a social media clip. It was the cost of escalation made visible in silence, in measured steps, in the unbearable weight of a ceremony designed to honor people who are no longer coming back. And that is what makes the rest of this day so jarring, because the same president who attended that dignified transfer also signaled that the war was not slowing down. Before the ceremony, Trump posted that Iran would be hit very hard, and said some areas and groups of people were under consideration for complete destruction and certain death. Later, when asked whether what he had just witnessed at Dover changed his thinking about pushing forward, he said, "We're winning the war by a lot." That contrast is the story, not only grief and not only force, but grief followed immediately by a promise of more force. That contrast matters, because Dover ceremonies do something speeches cannot. They strip away abstraction. Policy becomes personal. Strategy becomes 6 families. The conflict stops being a map, a briefing, a social post, or a cable news argument and becomes names, ages, hometowns, military units, parents, spouses, siblings, unfinished plans. Associated Press reported that the 6 soldiers killed in Kuwait were Majay, Jeffrey O'Brien, Captain Air Cody Cork, Chief Warrant Officer 3, Robert Marzan, Second Runner, First Class Nicole Amour, Sergeant First Class Noah Teachins, and Sergeant Declan Cody. A war can be sold in concepts. It can only be mourned one person at a time. That is why this moment lands so hard politically. A president can argue for military action. A government can claim progress. Allies can talk about deterrence. But once transfer cases arrive at Dover, the language changes. The burden of proof changes. Every next strike now exists under the shadow of a question the administration cannot avoid. What is the endpoint, and how many more ceremonies like this is the country being asked to accept? Even supportive voters hear that question differently after the first visible casualties. The debate is no longer theoretical. It is no longer about what might happen. It is about what already has. And the administration is trying to answer that question with a message of dominance. Trump has framed the campaign as a success and continued using maximal language toward Tehran. NBC reported that he said Iran should have a good leader, suggested he had names in mind, and kept pressing the idea of unconditional surrender. At the same time, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel still has many more targets in Iran, and that the campaign is continuing with full force. So the public message from both governments is not de-escalation. It is pressure, continuation, and the promise of additional action. But public messaging is only one layer. The battlefield picture, even for mainstream reporting, already looks more complicated than triumphal slogans suggest. NBC reported that oil depots in and around Tehran were hit, with fires visible in video from the capital. Satellite imagery published by NBC showed damage at Tehran's Mehrabad airport, with more than a dozen aircraft destroyed. The Israeli military said it had carried out roughly 3,400 strikes in Iran since the start of the war and dropped about 7,500 munitions, while saying the operation could continue for some time. That is not the profile of a conflict nearing closure. That is the profile of one widening in scale, intensity, and consequence. At the same time, the conflict is no longer contained to one battlefield narrative. NBC reported that Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, said Iran would no longer attack neighboring countries or launch missiles unless an attack on Iran originated from those countries. Whether that proves durable or not, it signals that regional pressure is real. Gulf governments are trying to prevent further spillover. Qatar said it intercepted incoming missiles. Saudi Arabia said it intercepted ballistic missiles aimed at Prince Sultan Air Base. And the UAE said it was dealing with incoming missile and drone threats. That means the war is operating on multiple clocks at once. The clock of military escalation, the clock of regional diplomacy, and the clock of how long nearby states believe they can absorb the danger. And then there's the civilian layer, which may end up shaping global opinion more than any battlefield map. NBC reported that preliminary findings in a U.S. investigation increasingly suggested a U.S. munition may have been responsible for a strike on an elementary school in southern Iran that killed more than 160 people, including children, while Trump publicly blamed Iran for the bombing. Human Rights Watch said the attack should be investigated as a war crime, arguing available evidence pointed to direct, accurate strikes rather than a random errant weapon. This is one of those moments where information risk becomes moral risk. If the public starts to believe the war is being narrated one way and experienced another, trust erodes fast. And once trust begins to erode, every official statement is heard differently. Every claim of precision is tested against images of funerals, schools, blackout zones, and families trapped inside a conflict they did not start. NBC reported that Iran has been under a national internet blackout for a week, according to NetBlocks, leaving the public isolated from updates and alerts. That kind of communications darkness does not just make reporting harder. It makes rumor stronger, fear stronger, propaganda easier, and accountability weaker. In that environment, every side tries to own the narrative, and every contradiction matters more than usual. Now, zoom out from the ceremony and the statements and look at the wider shockwave. The State Department said nearly 24,000 Americans had returned to the United States from the Middle East since the war began, while thousands remained stranded. NBC also reported repeated flight disruptions in Dubai, with airport operations only partially resumed after suspensions. Individual interviews in that same coverage captured the fear more clearly than any briefing. Travelers describing emergency alerts, canceled flights, and the tense relief of simply getting airborne and landing safely. Wars are often narrated as state action, but one of the fastest ways people actually feel them is through interruption. Closed airspace, stranded civilians, impossible itineraries, families waiting for someone to get home. Energy is the other fast-moving shock. NBC reported that Kuwait cut oil production as a precaution and said safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz had been affected. The same live coverage said traffic through the strait had dropped around 90% last week. You do not need to exaggerate that to understand the stakes. When one of the world's most important shipping corridors is disrupted, markets, insurers, governments, and households all start recalculating. You don't even need a full physical shortage for the consequences to spread. Fear alone can tighten supply chains, raise risk premiums, and alter behavior before the worst case ever arrives. So this is what makes the Dover image politically explosive. On one side, a ritual of national mourning. On the other, a regional war expanding into oil infrastructure, civilian air travel, diplomatic brinkmanship, and rival information campaigns. The president is asking the country to process both at once, to feel the gravity of military sacrifice, and still accept a harder line immediately afterward. That is a difficult balance for any administration. It is even harder when the first visible American deaths arrive before any clear public consensus on the war's duration, achievable goals, or exit conditions. And this is where the title of the moment almost writes itself. Trump honored 6 fallen soldiers at Dover, then immediately vowed to hit Iran harder. That sequence is not just emotionally striking. It tells you how the White House wants the public to interpret the moment. The ceremony says, "Remember the sacrifice." The rhetoric says, "Do not read that sacrifice as a reason to pull back. Read it as proof that the enemy must be hit harder." Historically, that is a familiar political move in wartime. Casualties are framed not as a warning about escalation, but as a justification for intensifying it. But the counterargument is already visible too. If the first week has produced 6 American dead, major regional disruptions, stranded civilians, missile interceptions across Gulf states, school strike controversy, and widening uncertainty about where the campaign stops, then harder is not automatically the same as smarter. Even people who support a tough response can still ask whether the strategy is coherent, whether the objectives are limited or expanding, and whether the public is being prepared for a short operation or a longer war that leaders do not want to name yet. Those are not anti-war questions, they are accountability questions. There's also a deeply human reason this tension will not fade quickly. AP's report from Dover focused on the families and the physical reality of the transfer itself, the carry teams, the flag-draped cases, the salutes, the stillness. That ritual can strengthen public resolve, but it can also sharpen skepticism. It forces people to decide what kind of sacrifice they believe is being asked for, and whether the mission justifies it. Democracies do not process battlefield deaths only through patriotism. They process them through questions. What changed? Why now? What is the objective? What happens next? How many more? And the what happens next question is now unavoidable because the reporting points in 2 directions at the same time. One direction is continued pressure. More strikes, more threats, more targets, more rhetoric about forcing surrender. The other direction is a fragile opening for containment, however small. Iran saying it will stop attacking neighboring countries unless those countries are used to launch attacks on Iran. Multiple regional governments stressing sovereignty and de-escalation, and visible anxiety from states that do not want to become the next theater of war. Whether those 2 directions can coexist is doubtful. Sooner rather than later, events will force one to dominate the other, and pay attention to how language is changing, because language often reveals the strategic drift before officials admit it. Early in conflicts, leaders talk in terms of necessity, precision, deterrence, limited aims. As wars broaden, the language often becomes more emotional, more personal, and more absolute. Hit very hard. Complete destruction. Certain death. Unconditional surrender. Those are not the words of a narrow, technically defined mission. Those are the words of escalation, and escalation always carries a second risk beyond military blowback. It narrows the political space for compromise later. Once leaders talk that way, stepping down feels like weakness, even when stepping down may be the safer course. That is why Dover matters far beyond symbolism. It may become the image that anchors public memory of this phase of the war, not the strike footage, not the maps, not the triumphant posts. The image of 6 transfer cases arriving home while the president promised even more force. If the war expands, that image will be replayed as the moment when the cost was undeniable and the decision was still to press harder. If the war eventually narrows or ends, that image will still remain as the clearest expression of the tension at the heart of this crisis. Grief did not produce restraint. It produced a harder vow. And maybe that is the real divide opening here. One side will hear Dover and say resolve. The other side will hear Dover and say warning. One side will say the fallen must be honored by finishing the fight. The other will say the fallen must be honored by refusing to drift into a larger one without a clear, honest case to the public. Those are profoundly different interpretations of the same ceremony, and they are going to shape everything that follows. Because once the dead are home, the country has to decide not only how to mourn them, but what it is willing to risk next in their name. So here's the bottom line. The most revealing sequence of this day was not only the ceremony at Dover, and it was not only the threat that followed. It was the collision between them. Trump honored 6 fallen soldiers in one of the most solemn acts a commander-in-chief can perform. Then he made clear that the answer, in his view, was not pause, not public reconsideration, not visible restraint, but more pressure on Iran. That does not tell you where the war ends, but it tells you exactly where it stood in that moment, at the point where loss had already become real and escalation was still being sold as the path forward.